want to just talk briefly about the importance of data in policymaking, and I want to make things a bit less abstract by just mentioning 4 specific policies or policy areas where I think we've had some challenges in the last few years. I think we all know that we are living in Kenya in an age of grievance politics, and these grievances that we are hearing about are not new, and they relate fundamentally to people's perceptions of fairness and perceptions of inequality. Who's getting what, and for how long they are getting it, and when others are going to have their turn. And those grievances are part of what drove constitutional reform. And what I want to suggest is that one of the challenges that we face in trying to address these grievances, and not just repeating cycles of contention and violence, is that we have to bring together our perceived sense of inequality with some data about who's actually receiving what, and some policy ideas so that we can come to the table and negotiate. So I want to then suggest that we need to bring together in any policy area, what we are trying to do is bring together data about needs, the needs that different people have, and the finances that we need to address those needs. Of course, we should also have some idea, some policy theory of change, that if we put in money in a particular way to address a particular set of needs, it will yield a particular outcome. And therefore, things will get better and we will move on from there. So we take needs, finances, and some theory of how policy works, and then we get change. That should at least be how things work. I want to point out 4 cases where I think we are still struggling with these 3 things that I've just mentioned. When devolution began, or when the Constitution was passed, we assigned a responsibility for different functions to different levels of government, but one of the confusing areas in this was who was going to be responsible for the regional hospitals, the so-called level 5 facilities, the former provincial hospitals, and a few other high-volume hospitals. So there was a lot of back and forth about who was going to be responsible for these hospitals, and in the end, the Transition Authority decided that these level 5 facilities should be managed by the host counties where they are located, so that they would be devolved. Now, in order for us to have a reasonable debate about how to manage and finance these hospitals, you would expect that the most fundamental information that we would need to have is how much does it cost to run an individual level 5 facility as of 2012-2013, the year before we devolved. That information was not available and has never been made available. If you go back to the budgets from 2012-2013 and before, you'll find lump sum figures for how much money goes to these regional facilities, but not individually broken down by facility, nor broken down further by the different things which that money would buy in those facilities. In order for us to have an intelligent conversation, a reasonable conversation, about how these hospitals can be run in the best way to provide services to people and actually impact on people's lives, what we need is information about people's health, and we need information about the finances, and we need a theory about how we combine the finances with how we bring to bear the finances on the problem to solve that problem. But lacking any information about the actual distribution of funding for these hospitals, it is very difficult to have that kind of conversation. So if we say that we have vast inequalities in access to health in the country, which we do, and we say that one of the primary mechanisms for addressing these inequalities is investing in health facilities, yet we have no data about how much it actually costs to run these facilities and how much money we're actually spending on these facilities, then it is very unlikely that we are going to be able to use this mechanism to solve this problem. A second issue that I want to mention, also from the health sector, is around the free maternity program. This program, presumably, is intended to address the problem that people need to go to facilities to deliver if they're going to have high quality skilled birth attendant care when they deliver, so that mothers don't die and children are well taken care of. And they're presumably struggling to do that because of the cost, and therefore the free maternity program has come along to reduce that cost so that people can access these facilities. I am not aware of any policy document that guides this free maternity policy. I have been told that such a policy document exists, but it has never been availed to me. There was a campaign document that was produced in 2013 as part of the election campaign, suggesting the policy to the president, which I've seen, but no actual policy document. So it isn't clear what kind of analysis went into the diagnosis which I just gave a brief summary of. But we will skip ahead to where we are today, and the question of whether we have the data and are using the data in effective ways to address the challenges around maternity. If you look at the 2017-18 budget, you will see two things of interest. One, the government has claimed prior to that, but you can see it again in in last year's documents, that access to skilled birth attendants has increased in Kenya from 44% before this policy was introduced to 66% a couple of years after the policy was introduced to 77%. But you will also find in the same documents that the target for in-facility births with skilled birth attendants is to rise from 59 to 63 in 2017-18. So we have either already surpassed, you can see that these two sets of numbers were generated by two different people or two different random number generating systems, because 5963 doesn't follow the pattern of 44, 66, 77. But in any case, we are either targeting 63% this year, or we have already reached 77%, and surely we are not targeting 63 if we have already reached 77. So if we need to have information about needs and finances and the theory of change about policy, then we have a problem on the needs side here already. The policy was introduced fully across the country 5 years ago, free services. Why are we only at 77% today? If, in fact, the main constraint for mothers to access services is the cost of those services and facilities. It seems extremely unlikely that that is the only constraint on accessing these services. Otherwise, we should be at a much higher number by now. If our theory of change, and I can only intuit what our theory of change is based on the policy, because there's no policy document, but if our theory of change is that the only thing that is stopping women from accessing these services is cost at the facility, it doesn't seem to be a rich enough theory about how things are working or not working. So we, again, lacking important data and a sufficient theory of change, are not able to actually address this problem, and we will not address this problem. The third area that I want to mention is the Equalization Fund. But, we attended a meeting that the CRA had held on this question of how to revise the marginalization policy. And there was quite some debate about how this policy should be used. And one of the things that was said is that the purpose of the Equalization Fund is that it is a catch-up fund. If you read the Constitution, the Equalization Fund says that this is to be used to bring services in marginalized areas to the average level enjoyed by the rest of the country. So there's a reasonable interpretation that that is something like a catch-up fund. However, we have a problem. And the problem is, if you talk to most people, they will agree that this equalization fund is one of the most important tools that we have for addressing marginalization. And it all sort of fits together, right? It's supposed to address these capital backlogs in the catch-up fund. It's based on a marginalization policy, and it's called equalization. So it sounds like it's going to equalize. The problem is that there's very little money in this fund. So we are talking about now the cumulative amount of money in this fund is getting to 20 billion for all the money from the fund that hasn't been spent since 2010. 20 billion is very little money in the grand scheme of things. When you think about the amount of money that goes to counties each year now, which is on the order of 300 billion, 20 billion is very little. And that equalization fund money is growing at a very small rate because it is a very small fraction of the budget. So why do I bring this example? Because the expectations that we have for this fund, that most people have for this fund, are completely out of order with what this fund actually contains. Ask yourself, what is the capital backlog in this country that would allow the marginalized parts of the country to catch up with the rest of the country, and whether 20 billion shillings is the order of magnitude necessary to achieve that kind of catch-up. So we have this discussion that goes on and on where we are talking about who's getting the money and why haven't we gotten the money and where's the money going and why isn't my county part of the 14 counties that's getting access to this fund. But imagine if all of the counties, because by the way, all of the counties are marginalized and they all want to access the fund. Imagine if the 20 billion was split between 47 counties and not just 14 counties. Then how useful would it become? So this discussion is divorced from reality. And why is that? Because we have a fundamental asymmetry between the needs and the financing. If you're actually realistic about the needs, and then you look at the financing, you will see that these two things don't speak to each other. And therefore, the equalization fund cannot be used in this way that it has been purported to be used, and we are having a meaningless conversation. So data about the actual needs, what it would take for the marginalized parts of the country to catch up to the rest of the country, if we had that information, it would help us to have a more realistic discussion about what the equalization fund can do and not do. Our view has been that this money should be used to target the most marginalized sub-county areas. So let's take this down further, say, to ward level, and identify the most marginalized wards. Because if we identify the most marginalized wards, with this small amount of money, we can actually do something in those wards. But there are many people who are arguing in this discussion that we're having that this was not acceptable and that this money was for counties. And the problem is that when you can make that argument, but when you make that argument without connecting it to the actual amounts of money and the needs that you're talking about, you are able to make an argument without connecting it to the fact, at the end of the day, what you are saying is that we are going to give 100 shillings to each person in 14 counties, and they will magically catch up with the rest of the country. Not realistic. Okay, I want to lastly mention something which is related to this and comes out of also from our discussions on Tuesday. John presented information on the distribution of the roads budget. And there are many gaps in the data that we have about how money for roads is being used in the country. There is information in the budget about the distribution of roads projects, although some things are not distributed. And that's what John presented. But the question we should be asking is, suppose that we have all of the information about how roads are being distributed. How should road money be distributed? What is the criteria by which it would be most equitable to distribute the budget for roads? And the fact is that we have no idea how to answer that question. No information has been provided about the criteria that we should use. So you might think, going back to what I was saying about the equalization fund, that the main criteria that we should use to distribute funds for new road construction is the capital backlog. In other words, we look around the country, we see who has roads and who doesn't have roads, we see who needs roads, and we do a calculation. We create some kind of index of people's relative access to roads, their need for roads, and we put money in those places where that index is low. That is, places where people don't have access to roads relative to the access that other people have. This would be some measure of the capital backlog. And this is the kind of thing that would be used by an investment bank or some other kind of, an infrastructure bank or some other kind of policy mechanism that would be trying to resolve historical inequities and inequities in access. Where is that information? We are often told that these discussions are so technical and it's so difficult. There's nothing technical about any of this. Basic questions. What is the need? What is the financing? What is the theory of change by which the financing addresses the needs? We need information about all three things. All three things, by the way, it is the responsibility of government to produce, but it is the responsibility of citizens to engage in that conversation and ask questions. And here, we get to the work that DI is trying to do. And you can see that what they are trying to do, at least, is to bring together the data on the financing with some of the data on needs so that the public can also engage in this conversation, try to bring together information about needs with financing and ask the right questions. But also, if the information that we need is not there, which it is in many cases, this looks very nice, but we all know that there are lots of data gaps, and some of the data is also very outdated, that if it is not there, active citizens will demand that it be there. It is only possible for a government to take hundreds of billions of shillings, distribute it willy-nilly across the country without telling you where it's going and how it's addressing the capital backlog in your country. So it is our responsibility to take whatever little data we have and begin to ask questions and put pressure on government to answer those questions.
We are an international independent organization and we work primarily around data use, and this data use is specifically for helping to effectively target interventions that would reach a need on the ground. So what the Development Data Hub is it's a portal that allows you to overlay socioeconomic indicators together with resources going to the ground. So you're able to see whether the money is actually meeting a need on the ground, or it's, if your health indicators at county level are really good, but your education socioeconomic indicators are really poor. When you look at the budgets, you expect that the county would be focusing a little bit more on education rather than health. But basically, that's what the Data Hub wants to do. And what we're trying to do with the Spotlight is highlight the geographic disparities that is masked within national statistics. So Kenya, according to the last publicly available data set, the national poverty headcount stands at 45.2% of the national population. But this does not translate very well when you look at it subnationally. The areas where people are really, really poor and the areas where they are not, it's not so bad. The top 10 poorest counties in Kenya actually average almost double, not average, the actual figure for poverty headcount is almost double the national average. What the Spotlight has, the socioeconomic data that we have are centered around 5 key themes. So poverty, vulnerability, population and demographics, education data, health data, water and sanitation, and now the county resource profiles. The Spotlight on Kenya is hosted on our data platform. That's data.devnit.org /spotlight on Kenya. So the first page you land on for Kenya is our visualization on poverty and vulnerability characteristics subnationally. So it's true to form. Basically, everyone knows the northern, northeastern areas of Kenya are quite underdeveloped, and the data backs this up. So we have here, we have the poverty headcount. We also have the poverty gap. But the interesting one, I think, is also the HDI. When you're talking about inequality, you will find that the poverty headcount and HDI figures actually mirror each other. Those areas where you would think are marginalized in Kenya are actually marginalized, and there is data to back that up, and that's the northern and northeastern areas. We also have demographic population characteristics. So total population is based on the 2009 census by county. You also have the density and the rural-urban population split by county. So when you look at this map and you see how densely, or rather, certain areas are very less densely populated, and you want to understand a bit more where are these people staying who are in those less in the less densely populated areas. If you do that, you'll find that most of the people living in north and the northeast of Kenya actually live in the urban centers rather than the rural centers. Rather than rural areas. And for health, we have also quite a bit of indicators. But in general, it holds true to form. Areas that are considered urban and developed have generally really good health indicators. So this, for example, is for a proportion of the population that had a skilled birth attendant during birth. And the central and western areas of the country generally perform really well. In fact, the high figures above 85, some 99, others are 100%. And then you go to certain areas and you find 25 in Marsabit, in Samburu 22, Wajir 21. So there are services that are needed in these areas that are not being, there's a need that is not being met in these areas. There is a slight challenge with how budgets are released by counties. So if you look at 2017, you'd think only, I should not think, but we have data from less than 15 counties presented up there. This is proving to be a challenge, and we are hoping from now, and once we start engaging a bit more with the counties, government starting from tomorrow, we'll be able to fill some of these gaps. So if you're interested in finding out how your county is performing, how they're spending their money, just go to the Spotlight and check it out.
I have Alcad from the Open Institute. He'll tell us a little bit more about OI. We have Florence from the SDG Forum, and I have Dr. Alex from the East African Institute. And I think I have a couple of questions for them, and I know you'll also have some questions for them. So, Flo, maybe tell us a little bit more about the SDG Kenya Forum, what you do, before I go into the work that you do around the SDGs specifically.
Thank you. So my name is Florence Yevo. I represent the Sustainable Development Goals Kenya Forum. This is an initiative of non-governmental organizations that came together in terms of a coordinated approach for sustainable development goals. I think one of the visions we had and we still have was the fact that during the Millennium Development Goals era, we had a lot of loopholes in terms of coordinated approach for the MDGs. So just one of the things that we thought we could do better is come together as civil society through a platform that could bring all of us within the different sectors. Because again, the issues of silos also existed a lot, where you find, I know like Kanko and the else related sectors always just doing things but by themselves. You find people on peace and security, on gender, and on all these other water and sanitation, on all other aspects of the SDGs. So the main idea and still is to have a coordinated approach where we can come together to build partnerships and also to ensure that our issues of implementation, both at national and county levels, are well articulated in terms of just coming together in terms of partnerships and also ensuring that collaborations also exist in this particular sector. Thank you.
So, Flo, I know you talked about coordinating SDGs at the grassroots, but I want to know what is the place of data in the forum and what are some of the biggest challenges, and maybe you can also touch on some of the solutions.
Oh, thank you. That's a very good question. I think one of the things that we realized, even when we were coming up with maybe the things that we could do as a platform, because the idea is individual organizations have a lot to do by themselves, but there are those things that need to be done in in unison or in networks or in platforms. One of the things that we actually identified was the issue of there was so much data gaps within the different thematic groups. And one of the challenges, for instance, we were facing is that there's very limited understanding among stakeholders. And I say this just from our own membership evaluation. We came to realize that a lot of people within non-governmental organizations, unless you're like the data technical people, DI, DG, and the rest who are very much into data, most of us actually do not really understand the data conversation in terms of what's not just the generation of data, but also the utilization and the whole process. Even if you, for instance, you have a research or a survey within your organization, how to effectively sort of from generation to impact, how this data, for instance, achieves impact within your own organization. We found that a lot of us are really, really struggling in terms of just understanding the whole process and how to effectively utilize that particular process. So one of the things that we've been doing is bringing together those that have experience or those that have a good understanding of how to better utilize data, especially for evidence-based interventions, to bring that experience to the local or to those that maybe are not specialists in that arena. And we've seen a lot of collaborations among, for instance, forum members who would come forth and say, can we have maybe some partnerships in this area? Can we have an understanding? Can we have capacity building? How do we furthermore sort of push this whole conversation apart from generating surveys or coming up with grassroots data? How do we utilize this for policy advocacy? How do we utilize this to come up with programs that have impact for communities?
Thanks so much, Flo. I'd like to move to Alex, and I know you'll tell us more about what the East African Institute does, and then I have some questions for you around the politics of data, because I know you've interacted with people and politicians.
So thank you very much, Karen. So the East African Institute is a policy-oriented research platform that is regional. That means that we work in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and hopefully Burundi someday. And our focus is on 4 main areas. One is urbanization. So the whole question about urban change, urban development, the pace of urbanization, the conversion of rural spaces into semi-urban spaces, the small towns, etc. But also trying to think about what we call urban analytics. What's the data that's going to inform urban development? The second thing that we do is food systems. We've conducted about 3 kinds of surveys in Nairobi, looking at wet market surveys, looking at how food gets into the city, where it comes from, how far, and what kinds of commodities. We've also looked at supermarkets. We've also looked at household food consumption patterns. What do people eat at home, and how much do they spend? And it surprised us that in Nairobi, the proportion of income at a household that is spent on food is higher than the proportion of your income that you dedicate to savings, to rent, and to health. That proportion is more than 30%. So about 30% of our income is spent on food in Nairobi. And the average distance of food procurement is about 175 kilometers. And the markets are around disorganized, self-interested, self-driven, entrepreneurs. So the system is very fragile, if I want to put it that way. The other area that we work on, which is what's going to be the data and the politicians, we've been looking at, initially we started off by looking at growth and inequality. So we started with a process to do some kind of an attempt to understand the spatial patterns of inequality in the country. What turns out is that Kenya is actually not one country. We have 5 countries in this country that are distinctly different, from GDP to all of the human development measures. They're 5 distinct countries, very, very different from each. But our model is really how do we do good research, bring the evidence to public conversation. We are just the people with the evidence, but the evidence is not important to us. It is important to the stakeholders. We're now looking at the sub-national, at the county level, do we see the same patterns of inequality? For instance, there's a ward in Kiambu whose, on most indicators, is worse than the average for Turkana in terms of infant mortality. So while you're sitting here saying Kikuyus have an advantage for over 60 years, it's not true. The patterns of inequality when you go to the sub-national level are so shocking that you begin to see these differences, so that it is important to start getting out of this national ethnic diatribe and really begin to understand how does the ordinary mwananchi really think, and what is our relationship with politicians as Kenyans, not as ethnic people, politicians as a different sub-tribe or a sub-race in this country.
Thanks for that, Alex. And actually, I'll pick from where you stopped in terms of politicians. What is the place, a country like Kenya, where we are now, what is the place of data in trying to tackle inequalities and poverty and eradication of poverty? Yet it appears that politics is playing a bigger role.
That's a very interesting question, because that's what Al and I were talking about. And we said, okay, so you can have data, you can have evidence, you can have all the things that you think when you line them up, and you have, as Jason put it, a reasonably plausible theory of change that you will then get certain outcomes. So, say for instance, you're trying to influence maternal mortality or child mortality. But politics really is about who gets what, where, and why. So it is actually the engine, is a mechanism of distribution. While you have the policy and you have the evidence to say that here's where the problem is, in terms of the implementation arrangements, the partnership structures you need to draw, until you get the politics right, you're basically just wasting your time. But the way to deal with politicians is to set them against the voters. So the big question really is, how does data get into the hands of the voting public? So the public has a certain amount of literacy to then ask the questions. So what is it that we want to get citizens to get involved in terms of providing the data, but also being users of the data and creating, through that data process, some kind of citizen activism in terms of demanding services and holding politicians to account. So citizens really are the ones who can deal with politicians. Someone like me, they will say, yeah, you're just another academic, but how do we communicate data and information so that the public can then use it in ordinary conversations to tell their stories about how the politicians are not working for them?
I think that's a really good parting shot, if I would say. How do we get citizens to be interested in the data? Is it how we're presenting it? Should we simplify, as Flo mentioned, that actually they don't understand these things we say when you say data and what? I have 2 questions for you, but first I'd like you to tell us what OI does.
Thank you. So the Open Institute was created for, we like to say, for the purposes of building a bridge between citizen and government. This gap between government and citizens is largely because of the fact that we don't know each other, for the most part. Citizens, apart from the people sitting in this room who deal with government and talk to government all the time, but citizens generally do not know what government does, or who is government, or how does it work. And then both of these people are trying to work for the same objective. they are both trying to make sure that development happens in their areas. Both of them have an interest in that respect. The question is a question of approach. So what we did is that we set up the Open Institute as a means to try and figure out how do we build a bridge that gets so that they actually say what they want government to do and what their criteria for evaluation of whether government is working or not will be. And then on the other side, how do we get government to be responsive to what the citizens are saying? Now, data is at the heart of this thing. So we realized that very early on that data is at the heart of it. So we started collaborating with government and trying to figure out how do we use data as a means. And one of the first things that Kenya did in this data space a few years ago was to release the Kenya Open Data Initiative. And a website was created, lots of data was put in and stuff like that. I was very actively involved in that. Biggest lesson, nobody used that data. Well, of course, I mean, you guys used the data, a couple of you, and, you know, Alex at his institute used the data and so on and so forth. But citizens, my grandmother did not use it. My mom, who is educated, did not use it. And I don't actually know an everyday citizen or a rural journalist who uses Kenya Open Data. So I started asking myself, so why? As we have gone on, we realized something, and it is a theory that we are currently exploring. And that is that citizens don't care about data. Citizens care about the things that are in front of their noses, the things that they experience on a daily basis. If you come out of your house and it takes you an hour to get to work 5 kilometers away because of traffic, and I asked you what your pain point is, you're not likely to tell me it's the lack of rain in Makueni. You're more likely to tell me that it is traffic. So if that is the case, then that for us means that we have to try and get citizens to use data at the level that they care about. Because then cumulatively, development will happen because of the fact that I can be specific to government, to the county government, about what it is that I want them to do for me because of the fact that I am stating specifics. So we have been working in a couple of subnational places around the country. In Lanetu Moja, for example, we did a mini census. We went and sat with the tweeting chief, talked about it and said, let's try and get the citizens themselves to collect data on themselves from every single household so that it is themselves. It is their data rather than government data and so on and so forth. And let's try and make sure that, yes, while we relate it to the SDGs, let's try and make sure that it is on stuff that they care about. So we got them to actually develop a survey together. We developed a survey together with the citizens. And we got them, give them mobile phones and said, go ye forth and collect data. At this point, we were dealing with the community leaders of Lanetu Moja. And we, over time started working with DI. We've worked with Civicus and a couple of others who've been interested in this. And we got the citizens to go out and collect the data. So they collected data from every single household of their 12,000 households in the community. When we were going in, we knew that from KNBS data that there was about 7,500 households in Lanetu Moja at the time that the census was done. And projections said that there's like another 1,000 that have increased. When we went there, we found there's actually 12,000 households. Now, guys, if government is trying to cook ugali for 7,500 people, and yet there's 12,500 people, then there's a problem, right? And that's what we started to discover. So all of this data come into play, and all of this data is sitting in the community with the chief. Based on the fact that they have that data, they're able to now, as citizens, come up with their own priorities and decide that this is actually, if government was to solve one problem, then this is actually the one that affects everybody within the community. If that's the case, then solve that one problem. Okay? And you get my vote. So they did that. They found out that health is a big deal for them. They met the county government just before the elections, which is a really, really good time, and said, if you want my vote, build a health center here. So, of course, when, like Alex says, if you put governments and voters together, what happens? government acts. So government said, okay, but we have a problem. We don't know where to put the health center because we don't have land in your area to put the health center. The citizen said, wait, but we do have land because there's a cattle dip. Do you guys know what a cattle dip is? There's a cattle dip in the area that we have not been using for a long time because nowadays we do zero grazing. So convert that into the health center and we're happy with you. So they did. And Moja has a health center. Point is this. We are now figuring out that apart from data, there are some socio-political things that maybe within our sector we need to start becoming more aware of, and we need to start educating ourselves.
I think it's good that you've inspired us with your story. And I think something you mentioned actually in terms of data that was in LANET was not up to date. And actually the data that we use on the Spotlight is 2013 projections. It's not up to date. What is the problem in terms of, from an open data aspect, why is data not availed, even if it's been collected? I know the 2015-16 KIHBS is ready, but why do we struggle with getting data that is open, timely, accessible, comparable?
Well, one of the theories that we have been exploring is this. If you look at how government is structured today, we have, we don't govern ourselves. We elect representatives who then are expected to do stuff on our behalf. And that system of government is centuries old. It's been there for very many centuries. And sometime in the past, in one of those centuries in the past, it was decided that we have to keep things away from the citizenry. They should know what government is doing. We are now trying to change a culture that we have developed over all the centuries. That's one of the reasons. I think it's tough. The second thing is when we release data, we put out this stuff without actually thinking about what is the social motivation for people to actually use the data. When we think about the logistics of actually data production in the country, then you begin to see where the problem lies. One, we are still collecting data the way we were collecting data in 1963, right? Our census is done the exact same way. And then we know that in the middle of the year, we must do this thing called an economic survey. And at some point, we have to do a budget, and that budget has to be fed by this specific document. In Uganda, they have started experimenting with something called the Community Information System, which they say, fine, we will do the statistics as we have been doing them for centuries, but in addition to that, let's find some administrative data. So they started collecting this data from the communities and making sure that they sort of read it together with the national statistics. Maybe that is one way that we could go in terms of innovating how we handle data and how citizens then begin to care about data.
Thanks, Al. I think just taking us back to our agenda for today, the Spotlight on Kenya, and the other number of platforms that are existing, how do we start using such platforms to sort of close that loop, to bring citizens in, bring politicians in, bring the media in, and then start seeing that change?
I think we need to figure out some kind of architecture around data communication, action, citizen engagement, and action. And it's about numbers. It's a question of really making sure that data just becomes a way to validate the scale of need. But those needs must be met. Data just represents them. Data is just a way to put numbers to these things. So we get to a point where we can engage citizens in a conversation about their needs, and then plot from those needs to the solution, and then figure out in that journey, who else do we need in the conversation? And who else then means the political actors, but also the other sectors that are important to that. So I'll give you a very quick example. We have implemented free primary education since Kibaki's time. in certain, this has made a in terms of improving literacy. Okay? Many parts of the country, you'll see the numbers have gone up. Every cohort of class 1 is, this time we hit 1 million for the first time. 1 million kids start class 8. But if you look at the enrollment, 8 years ago, for this cohort that just finished, it is not 1 million. It's probably about 1.3, 1.5. Where are the other kids? Now you want to start tracing these kids. Not all of them live in Kiambu. They're in Turkana, they're in Marsabit. So you're looking at number of kids who are out of school who started, who enrolled, but did not complete. Twaweza has a lot of work on numeracy and literacy tests across the country. They tell us that there's a correlation between numeracy and literacy between grades 1 and 3 and the level of a mother's education. And this has been consistently demonstrated over the time that Twaweza has collected this data. If you go to Turkana, literacy is less than 6% among married women. So what we're basically saying is that those kids are preordained to fail, those numeracy, because it's consistent, the data shows that. So if we're implementing free primary education, that policy must be bundled with adult literacy classes for the mothers so that they support the kids to learn. So it is this differential understanding of what you need so that policy is effective. So it is getting the need and then mapping those needs and then create. So in that process, then by understanding all these things, you understand the theory of change. The theory of change is not that free primary, that the only thing that stops kids from going to school is tuition. Tuition is not the barrier to education. So what I'm trying to say is that we really need, as a data community, to find a better way to communicate with government.
My biggest concern is that if we do not get right this conversation, the data conversation, especially for the Sustainable Development Goals implementation, then we will still go back to the years of failure in terms of what happened to the MDGs and coming back to the same sort of platform of missing out as a country and even more importantly as Africa. I say this because when you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and all the targets and indicators, there's so much that needs to be done in terms of getting right, if it's on water and sanitation, all those indicators, providing timely data and the issues of reporting, monitoring and evaluation. And when you look at Kenya, for instance, when we've interrogated this through Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, we see that there's still a lot of gaps. And these gaps, most of them, when we interrogate further, the conversation is more that we need to demystify the myth, especially at a national level, where from the government perspective, it still looks like the topic on data is a huge burden, especially in terms of financing. I say this because I believe strongly that we, from the non-governmental sectors, we have a very huge role. And this time around, what I'd want to see, because as I said, I think I'm speaking to many data experts, is for us to see tangible solutions or ways of engagement. The few times we've tried to speak to random counties, apart from maybe Nakuru and Lanet, Umoja, and those few that are very, very deeply into this conversation, most of them, of course, as you can imagine, do not really understand the whole conversation. So how else or how best can we also target the county conversations to ensure that counties or county officials, not just from a few counties, it's more about scaling up what's going on. So I believe it's just changing the paradigms in terms of understanding it at a national level, what needs to be done, and let's not keep talking about what needs to be done. It's the actuals. I'd be happy in the next sort of platforms or meetings, really talking about this is the issues that are existing at a national level, and maybe this is what we can do.
I have a couple of suggestions here. 3. One, I think as what I would loosely call a data community, we need to achieve coherence. there's so many of us doing data portal. There's so many of us collecting data. There's so many of us working with different subnational, national, etc. groups that are doing something or the other. If I am KNBS and I'm listening, and I came to this meeting, and all of you got a chance to tell me the work that you're doing around data, I would be very overwhelmed, because I would be hearing it eventually. There's a threshold that it gets where it is then converted into noise. When I go back to the office and they ask me, so you met with 100 civil society organizations who work on data, and they all told you what it is that they're doing with data. So what is your takeaway? I said, people are working, right? So we need to achieve some coherence, and coherence is like this. We need to find some way in which the various groups that are working on health begin to work together, and the various ways that people working on education begin to work together, and all of us who are working on data begin to work together and speak with one voice, even if we are presenting 5 different points to government, because that's the only way that we can be heard easier, better, and so on. 2, I feel that we have to achieve innovation from a logistical perspective. What I mean is that we have to help the data producers, whether it is within the ministries, the counties, KNBS, and so on, to find ways in which they can innovate the process of data collection, so that it can be more real-time, so that it can be more regular, so that it can be faster. And secondly, to prove that, to demonstrate that regular data collection does not necessarily mean unscientific data collection. And it does not also necessarily mean that because of the fact that the data is changing so much that policy cannot be done. And the first and the final thing in my list of suggestions is we have to figure out how we manage interests. Data is political, and politics is about interests. Now, if politics is about interests, then and you know, I am from Kiambu, and you're trying to tell me that I have to figure out how to equalize the country, even though that I don't have the experience of Mandela. You have to find a way of making it worth my while to do it. And I'll give you guys a story. When we were doing the Kenya Open Data Initiative, we knew the country did not have a data portal. We had never been open. The question of openness was not something that Kenya was willing to consider. So when we went to the president to present it and said that we want to do this, we said it will create jobs. Why are we saying it will create jobs? Because of the fact that at the time, the priority for the Kibaki government was jobs. So we were just trying to align ourselves with what the prevailing interest was. We got the president to want to build jobs using open data, and there was byproducts that then serve the other purposes. So managing interests is going to be a critical thing that we try and do.
My question is this: I have heard from each of the the panelists say that we need to collaborate, we need to work together so that we stop duplicating duties. So maybe asking, could we maybe form a platform in which from here, there is something we are going to do to ensure we start working together. I'll give a very brief reason why I think so. For example, in Kanko, we have kind of scratched our heads and thought we might not have time to build our own model to engage the citizens. So we borrowed a model from the US, from America, called results model. It's working. And one of the things we are struggling with, at least I'm managing the program, and one of the things we are struggling with is now that we have the grassroots and we are really engaging the citizens through the grassroots. Where is the data so that when we go to engage, for example, the governor, we are not beating about the bush? And that's why I was asking about Elgeyo Marakwet. I can't wait to go and start a grassroots chapter there, because data is already on the table. I don't need to think what I need to go and do. So I think, actually, I wasn't coming to this forum today. I've been in the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then I thought, Thursday is about data. What does that? Then in the morning, it just occurred. This is the data group that can give me what I need. And I want to say, for example, Turkana. We have gone on the ground and gotten representatives, grassroots in every ward in Turkana. In the Ilodua, we have champions in Turkana, teachers, clergy, etc. At national level, we have professors, we have businessmen who are living in Nairobi, but their birth county is Turkana. And when we engage them every month, we meet, each group meets for 2 hours only each month to address an issue. By the time we are addressing this issue, we should have data. And this is the data that you are wondering, what do we do with this data to get to the grassroots? And therefore, like in Turkana, we went to engage the governor, and he was asking, prove it. But fortunately, we had done some level of research, we had evidence. But if we are left doing the implementation, and there is a group giving us data on monthly basis for the counties, then we are complementing each other. So I hope, at least I don't know whether it's IBP or it's DI or whoever, to spearhead the working together, even if it's 30 minutes a month or whatever. Thank you.
Yes, I've had the privilege of working in a huge number of sectors, and it's always so interesting to me, because I keep hearing it. I've had a chance to think about it at length. We should work together. I think we should work together is an objective truth. It's just that we usually leave it at we should work together, and then we don't ask ourselves how we should work together. So just like my colleague said, and we don't realize that working together is a labor in and of itself. It takes its own work. It needs people to do it very deliberately and very consciously. And so maybe one suggestion, and because I've seen this everywhere. I'm currently in the creative sector. I left health. We dash in and out of civil society. It's the same thing. Like if we look at health as an example, we saw the doctors go on strike. A lot of us said we would have solved many of these problems if all of them had gone on strike at the same time. Then the crisis would have been acute and deep, and we would have had to look at it all, as opposed to solving the doctor's problem while knowing the nurses were going to follow. When we finally solve the nurses, we know that the clinical officers and allied health workers will follow. And so we're just kind of running around this same issue and making each of these cadres of people prove their importance. So when we start trying to understand what does working together mean, it doesn't mean that all of us in this room need to be in the same email thread or WhatsApp group. It does mean that we can second one person from every organization to go to this sort of meeting, that we allocate resources for that meeting to happen, that we have each person come to give us feedback. What did everybody at that meeting say? So that we have an idea of what these things that everybody is talking about look like. It could mean we make a practice of making joint presentations such that we know this is so-and-so's lane, this is so-and-so's lane. It could mean many things, but the work of togetherness is as important as the work of doing what we are doing. And until we recognize it as that, then we'll always state the objective truth without knowing how we can achieve it. One of the things that I really like about this meeting in particular is hearing about all the phase 2 researches. So we know we implemented free primary education, for instance, and what. But then what does it mean in this place? And what does it mean when we now start looking at mothers? Because I always feel like when you start thinking about all the other people that are linked to the network of people in an ecosystem, then now you're really diving in. And that's not like the startup or the beginner level. It's now going intermediate. It's going a lot deeper. So I feel like there's a lot of honor that I have to give and respect to the people in this room for sticking with a thing long enough to arrive at phase 2, because arriving at phase 2 means phase 3 is possible, phase 4, etc. So that's a big deal. I really love what she said about going where the people are. it's becoming hard to get conversations between rights holders and duty bearers, if we're going to use lingo like that. And we'll never be able to have those ideal situations where some of these meetings happen the way in which they're supposed to happen. But then exactly what Alkag said about moving the data where people are, even if it's not places where data usually goes. So if we have to talk to women's guild meetings about what it means when children are not going to school, if we have to talk to them about what it means when some of them are helped to give birth at home by traditional birth attendants, vis-a-vis going to hospital, vis-a-vis all the in-betweens, if we have to go to political parties or gather several political parties in a room so that it can be, you cancel both sides and it becomes non-partisan. If it becomes things like that, it just means that wherever people are already gathered, we go. If it means getting all the, like what Alex said, all the sexy sound bites of data, the one of this percentage of women did, the little shocking bits that then start interesting conversations, and then now having people slide in later with the meat of the data, but like having that little bit that was interesting be talked about by Maina Kageni or be talked about by Larry Mado or something like that, such that it's the thing that people remember that they had him say or her. So maybe that is also a thing that we should think about in as far as making data move, because it is not all our jobs to move data into the public sphere, but there's many of us who do the work of trying to make data easier for people to swallow, and figuring that out and linking up with those people, I guess, is very useful. So maybe that's all I have to say.
I'm trying to figure the role of academia in all of this, in the entire space for development, addressing inequalities and so on, and realizing that every year you have a finite amount to spend, and now you need to work on, priorities might change, but the long-term priorities don't change equally as fast. So I'm interested in finding out from you as a member of academia, what space are you guys occupying? Is it active in terms of research work? Is there like, do you have a catalog as an institution, or do you work with other academic institutions and produce research papers that can inform long-term development for Kenya?
So thanks. So I think the role of academia in this country has been reduced to just training young people and giving them certificates. I think the role of academia in providing that kind of intellectual turning plate for the country has not been utilized. So the unfortunate thing is that we are a third world country. So we farm out everything to the World Bank, the African Development Bank, to UN, etc. It's like they think for us. And if I went to the Ministry of Finance and put something on the table, they'd be a little skeptical about it. But if IMF put something on the table, they'll read it. Even I myself quote a lot of stuff that is done by IMF, World Bank, UNICEF, WHO, and all these things. So I think we've really undercounted what our local academic institutions can do. And we are mostly overwhelmed with teaching, and we produce very little research. And even research funding. It's only recently that we've now decided that we put 1% of our GDP to finance research through NACOSTI. That process is still a little tricky in terms of finding active academic researchers. Okay, there's a lot of professors in universities, but can they be effective researchers? That's a big question. But so if you look at the way we are structured at Aga Khan, we are trying to deliberately respond to that need, where we're saying that this ivory tower thing has to end. That's why we've created this policy research platform, which is the bridge that now takes this excellent academic research, creates a policy relevance for the research that we do. Because not all research is policy relevant. Okay, I remember when I did for my PhD, would bore the hell out of you. But that's the business of academia. But now, how do we make sure that we can do that translation from all of these things and make sure that it is guided by what is important for communities? So I think this is where we must find relevance. And then also, inter-university collaboration is very weak. Again, because we are not well funded. as a public university system. So that to collaborate with JKUAT, for instance, we can do it as Aga Khan because we can put some money on the table, and with other universities across the region. But between JKUAT and Nairobi University, for instance, it's very difficult unless they get an acoustic grant or they get an Inter-University Council of East Africa grant, requires collaboration among universities, or the British put some money on the table and they say we need at least 3 or 4 universities collaborating together. But it is not something that we do by ourselves. But I think the biggest thing really is the public understanding of the role of universities, but also the government, the politicians appreciating that we're putting so much money into these institutions. We should start demanding something from them. What is our university doing for us in terms of solving problems? Like Nairobi has so many problems, 1 million of them, but there is every university that is registered in this country in Nairobi. But they all just do other things. They train a lot of kids and a lot of adults in the evening. That's why they're here, because this is where the money is. They're chasing after the money. They're not trying to figure out how to partner with the public sector, with civil society, with the private sector, to then co-create solutions, and even with communities for the citizens and the publics that they deal with. So I think this is our real big problem. But for us as an institute, I think the brilliance of our architecture is that I'm a member of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, even though I'm the director of the East Africa Institute. And all the appointments into that professor level would have to be joint appointments with an active teaching and research faculty in the university. The East Africa Institute is where you come to do the policy relevant research. Okay? So there's a difference there. So we're trying to say we have to serve a critical public need, which is creating public goods that actually solve real problems. And the areas of research that are outlined are not driven by donor research. We have our own internal money to basically stay on these things. So we'll be staying on these things for as long as the university is alive. So we'll not shift from big data and data analytics because there's no donor for it. We'll find internal money to bridge the gaps and actually create that consistency in terms of producing these things. So for us, it's a long-term commitment. But I think as tax-paying Kenyan publics, we need to demand the same level of engagement